Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America. Hi, everyone. I'm Janine Turner, founder and co-president of Constituting America. Welcome. Come on in. We're going to be talking about the Constitution and immigration today with Dr. Portteus. So it'll be very interesting. This is a 3-segment series on immigration. We're starting out with the founders, then we're at Ellis Island, and then immigration and the Constitution today. So it's the Constitution, the founders, the Constitution and Ellis Island, and the Constitution and immigration today. So it's 3 weeks, and we're thrilled that you're with us today. I'm Janine Turner, actress by trade. You can check all that out at janineturner.com. But we founded Constituting America in 2010. So it's 11 years now with Constituting America. And we have a great show in store for you today. I'm going to introduce the rest of the panel in just a minute. I'm going to introduce Kathy Gillespie. And Kathy is co-president of Constituting America, dear, most wonderful friend. We're just like an eagle. It takes 2 wings to fly. And if it were not for Kathy, I'd be flapping around on the ground with all my ideas, just hopping, trying to fly. And you, our donors, are the wind beneath our wings. So between you, the donors, and Kathy Gillespie and I as 2 wings, we are able to soar with this foundation. Kathy was the chief of staff on the Hill forever. So boy, does she know how to get things done. With sheer will, we love to say and joke. But she also is now one of the 17 private citizens chosen to serve on the Semi-Quincentennial Commission, planning our country's 250th birthday. And she was also the president of the White House Fellows. So Kathy Gillespie, hello.
Hi, Janine. Thank you so much for your leadership of Constituting America. I might get a few things done, but you definitely point us in the right direction and keep us headed towards always improving. So thank you for all that you do. I want to take a minute and thank our sponsor today, who wishes to remain anonymous, but our sponsor is a regular listener on Constitutional Chats and is a regular reader of our 90-day study program, which we're currently studying the Declaration of Independence with a different essay every day on the signers of the Declaration and principles embodied in the Declaration. And our donor wanted to be sure and encourage all the other listeners of the Constitutional Chats to go on our website and sponsor a chat if you can. So we thank everyone for being with us today, and thank you for all you do to make our programs possible here at Constituting America.
Yes, thank you very much, anonymous donor. We appreciate you. Okay, Tova Love Kaplan is at school today. It's her second day back in school in Chicago. She's a junior in high school, just finished her SAT and her ACT. We've known Tova, Tova, just when you come on, tell us how many years. Is it 4 years, 5 years now?
Yeah, since 8th grade, so 4 years, I think.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. She's just extraordinary. She's a 3-time winner of our We the Future contest. She's a national youth director of Constituting America. She runs a youth advisory board, like a top CEO of a top 100 company. She is passionate about inspiring young people to know and use their constitutional rights. And we are just so proud of her. And you're going to see her someday as Secretary of State or whatever she wants to be, president even, or the UN, because she speaks 3 languages. All right, Tova, I don't know how she does everything she does. And she also runs our book study, which is going to be Thursday night, by the way. So Tova, say hello.
Thank you so much, Janine. I'm so happy to be here as always. Just so honored to be part of this amazing organization. And thank you to our donor. It's so generous. And to echo Janine, please join our book club this Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to be doing a book about natural law. It's called Written on the Heart. It's really fantastic. So we hope to see you there and enjoy the show.
Yay. Okay. Then we have 2 new co-hosts with us. They're brothers. And we think they just rock and roll. We're thrilled they're with us today. Jewel and Jorn Gilbert. Jewel and Jorn Gilbert, let me tell you about them. They've also won our contest. We've known, gosh, 4 or 5 years we've known Jewel and Jorn as well. And Jewel is the executive producer and Jorn is operations director of Sing for America, which is a family-based company that the brothers co-founded. They get along so well. They're just so close. Y'all can laugh at that or say whatever you want when you come on, but you appear to be so incredibly close, which is wonderful. Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance. Both are proud former winners of our We the People contest. We're thrilled about that. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions, and public entertainment events, all while revealing a colorblind world stage. Jewel and Jordan are recent graduates of Moravian College, where they earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. So, they're yin and yang though, because both of them are artists, but they're also really, really brilliant. So we're thrilled that you're with us. Hello, Jewel and Jordan.
Hello, thank you for having us, of course, and the ability to learn throughout meeting all of these awesome people like Dr. Portteus throughout this couple of weeks here that we've been on. I mean, we've really covered a lot really fast. I know I keep disappearing, but treated as some theater, I guess. I don't know what's going on. We don't have our green screen behind us today, so I guess this is what you guys have been dealing with. But you could just, Jordan, move your mouth whenever I disappear, and then the people won't be too confused.
Well, you can also just take that background off if you want to, because you are sort of appearing like Jesus there. It's kind of interesting. But you might want to just take that back if you want to. Well, I'll let you figure it out. But well, okay. Thank you. We're thrilled y'all are here. Jordan, you want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. Another week, another chance to learn. Very happy to be talking about our founders and learn some more about immigration and what their thoughts were.
Yeah, me too. I'm very excited about this. Okay, drum roll, please. I'm going to introduce our constitutional expert on our constitutional hot topic, which is immigration in the Constitution. Aren't we all curious about this? I am, and it's really good to be informed. Okay, Dr. Portteus, are we ready? Dr. Portteus joined the faculty of Hillsdale College, which we all love, in 2008, and is the Lawrence Fertig Professor of Politics and Director of American Studies at Hillsdale. He previously taught at Belmont Abbey College near Charlotte, North Carolina, and Mountain View College in Dallas, Texas. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree, summa cum laude, from Ashland University, majoring in political science and mathematics, and took his Master of Arts and Doctor of Philosophy degrees in politics from the Institute of Philosophic Studies at the University of Dallas. Dr. Portteus' research interests are in the political thought of the early American Republic, Congress, and the administrative state, just like we love Dr. Portteus. His work has appeared in numerous scholarly and mainstream publications, including American Political Thought, the Journal of the Abraham Lincoln Association, American Greatness, American Mind, The Federalist, Forbes, and Human Events. Dr. Portteus, welcome to the show, and I look forward to your opening remarks.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Do you want me to go ahead and?
Tell us our opening remarks.
Okay, great. So I was asked to come in today and talk a little bit about immigration and the American founding. This is obviously one of the sort of intractable issues of our politics. We don't seem to be able to solve it, but there's not a lot of clear thinking in our public debate regarding the relationship between basic principles, the Constitution, and actual concrete public policy outcomes. And so what I wanted to do in terms of sort of introducing the topic was to kind of hit 3 points. The first one of which is, what is it that makes someone a citizen? Today, we commonly accept the idea that if you are born in the territory of the United States, that's what makes you a citizen. That in and of itself is what makes you a sort of part of the American people. But this is something that for many years, more than a century after the country was founded, was not part of our law, of our tradition, of our basic set of principles. It was kind of imported in later on. Birthright citizenship, in the eyes of America's founding fathers, was a relic of medieval feudalism, and it was something that we wanted to get rid of. The idea that you were bound to the soil in some way, that you were connected to it in that way. Citizenship for the American founders was based on consent, and consent was a kind of mutual and reciprocal relationship among equals. Political obligation was a consequence of the voluntary consent of the individuals who made up the society. It was not a result of some arbitrary factor such as birth, right? And we even find this in the 14th Amendment, where there are two requirements for citizenship. The first being that you be born or naturalized in the United States. And the second, which we tend to overlook, is that you be, quote unquote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, meaning that you are not rightly subject to the jurisdiction of any other nation. Right? The intention of this amendment, at least in the immediate historical sense, was to confer citizenship on freed slaves who met both qualifications. The second point that I wanted to touch upon is the idea of national sovereignty. Right? The idea that if each person's membership in the society is a matter of mutual consent, then that's what constitutes us as a society of equals, right? That a society that's constituted in that way has a right to regulate who's allowed to enter into its territory, in the same way that you or I as homeowners have the right to regulate who comes in the front door. That is to say, as long as, or excuse me, in the eyes of the rest of the world, all of this area, all of the United States constitutes one sovereign territory that is the property of the people of the United States. And so we have the collective right to regulate who comes in the nation's front door, just like we as individuals have that same right with our own properties. And this is actually found in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, where it confers upon the federal government the right to, as it says, define and punish offenses against the law of nations. And the law of nations in their thought was simply the law of nature applied to sovereign nations. So treating nations in the way that the law of nature treats individuals, right? Nations can regulate the use of their property, and so who can ingress into it. That is to say, non-citizens under the law of nature don't have a right to be here, right? There's no inherent right to citizenship in the United States or in any other country for that matter. And so they recognized that if an immigrant can successfully impose himself on a political community in violation of its laws, then the relationship between the immigrant and the community is not a relationship of equals. It's a relationship of superior and subordinate, right? The unlawful immigrant in that case is establishing himself as the rightful superior. He's in effect saying to the rest of the people that he has the power to dictate on his own the terms of the contract between himself and the rest of the community. Okay, so the third point, and I'll make this quick because I know I'm running short on time, is to stress the character of citizens in a republic. America's founding fathers asked a lot of American citizens. They said that Republican government, small r, Republican government, presupposes more virtue and character in its citizens than any other type of government. The problem is that people are going to be coming here from places that don't stress the development of those types of virtues. And one of those virtues is assertiveness, a willingness to fight for your rights. And if you live in a tyranny, you don't learn how to do that. But they believed that was absolutely vital to Republican citizenship. And so what they expected then was that, not that we would shut things off, right? They didn't propose to do that, but the people who come here have to learn our values and have to, and the word that's commonly used is assimilate, right? They have to become part of our part of our way of life. They have to accept our basic principles and integrate themselves into the larger society. So those would be the three things, just as a kind of quick introduction, that I would want to stress about the way that the founders thought about immigration.
Okay, that's fantastic, and really tease this up, right, for the golf game here.
I hope so.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. That was terrific. Okay, I'm going to back all the way up to the feudal system, because I thought that was really interesting, being bound to the land by the feudal system. And I guess to explain that, in the days before America, if you lived in, say, England, you were in the feudal system. If you were born there and you didn't happen to be a king or a baron, you were bound and naturalized to be a indentured or servant of some sort, and you to serve the king with their land. So go into that a little bit, and how they didn't want that here, but then eventually we did naturalize here. And so there's an arc that I just, from one end to the other, I thought we might explore.
Yeah, so in medieval Europe, and England is probably the most useful example, since our legal system has some antecedents there. Your citizenship, it wasn't really citizenship. You were a subject of the ruler under whose protection you were born. And the idea was that ruler provided you with protection at a time in your life when you were incapable of protecting yourself. And so lifelong obedience or loyalty to that ruler was a kind of payment of debt. Right? You owed him for the rest of your life for what he did for you when you could not do for yourself. And so the simple fact of being born in that place, regardless of any other circumstance, made you a citizen. It didn't matter what you wanted to do, where you wanted to go. It didn't matter who your parents were or where they came from. And you couldn't walk away. There was no right to emigrate, to leave. Right? You had, the only way that you could be discharged from your responsibilities as a subject of that ruler was if that ruler discharged you. In other words, if he looked at you and said, I consider your debt fulfilled and you can go and do what you want. Right? But unless and until that happened, you were a lifelong subject of that ruler. And like I said, neither blood nor consent nor anything else had anything to do with it, right? So that was the original medieval understanding. And so it was really radical for the Americans to come along and say that citizenship was a matter of consent, right? That the people that ruled us because we consented to them. If you ever happen to get your hands on British currency, for instance, it'll say, in one place, it'll say Dei Gratia Regina, Elizabeth II. And Dei Gratia Regina means by the grace of God, Queen. Now, today that's a legal fiction, but hundreds of years ago that had real meaning. So that her claim to rule, or his claim to rule in the case of kings, was based on divine right. Whereas what Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and people like that says, no, the authority to rule, the basis for rule, is the consent of the governed, the free assent of those who make up that society, right? And they do so as equals, contracting with each other for the sake of protecting their rights. And that also meant that there was a right to leave under certain circumstances, right? That you could go, that you could renounce your citizenship, that you could walk away under the right circumstances, and then go try and live somewhere else and become a part of that society, perhaps.
So in America, you can actually leave if you want, right? If you were in the feudal society under a king or queen, you could not leave. You were bound. There was no.
That's correct.
So that's really interesting. We get to choose. They did not get to choose. And wouldn't you say that's what's happening today in the communist China and all these countries, North Korea and all of them around the world? They're living under dictators. You can't easily leave communist China. And during the days of communist Russia, you certainly couldn't leave either, or,
Sure.
Eastern Germany. And I think we've lost that in the rising generations, really understanding about communism, that this isn't just some old feudal thing from hundreds of years ago within our own 20th century, and still continuing in our 21st century. We still have areas where you're born and you can't leave, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And that's the difference. And this is a critical difference. And it's the difference that government by consent makes between citizens and subjects. Now, on the one hand, I am subject to the law, but on the other hand, I'm a citizen in the sense that, at least as we were originally set up, we could discuss what's going on today, but I'm a citizen in the sense that I share in rule, right? And that was the critical distinguishing factor, right? If you're a citizen, then you share in political power, either directly, right, through some kind of direct democratic arrangement, or indirectly through representatives. And that's part of the reason why it's so critically important that we know who's here and who our citizens are, because those are the people who get to participate in rule. Those are the people who get to make decisions that govern the whole society. And it would be an injustice to those of us who are citizens to allow those who have not been sort of integrated into the contract to participate in that rule, to participate in rule. Whereas in a place like East Germany, Soviet Union, Communist China, there's no meaningful participation in rule. It's simply, here's the regime, the state, the party, and you're told, do X.
Very much exists today, and we tend to lose sight of that. Okay, I want to toss it to Tova, but I think a couple of things were in my mind. You know, in disregard today, but in the time of the founders, they were very concerned, and you know, this could certainly, you know, we could certainly piece this puzzle into today. But if we keep it in the context of the founding, they were very concerned about foreigners integrating into our voting system, or into because they thought that people might come over from England and we were fresh new country, and they didn't want foreigners coming over here and being a part of the voting process, because they could switch the whole tenor, the whole future of the country with their vote. They were very concerned about that, weren't they?
They were, and they had this is something they really thought through, because they never proposed sort of turning off the tap to new immigration. And a lot of Jefferson, Franklin, others said, look, you know, if you're someone who wants to come here, who can contribute in a meaningful way, and who wants to become, then we're open to that. But what they were concerned about was that people would come here and not understand our very unique political way of life, right? That the kind of person who's going to come here is the kind of person who's getting a raw deal where they're at, right? That is to say, you don't immigrate for no reason, especially at that time when, you know, crossing the ocean for a person of limited means and given the difficulties meant that was probably forever, and you had probably lost contact with everyone that you knew and loved in the place that you came from. So that was a really big deal, right? But there was a concern that you know, those people were leaving because they were oppressed, because they were impoverished. I mean, I have an aunt who's done genealogical research on my Italian relatives, and she kept coming up on these Italian birth certificates with the word contadina. And so she very naturally, being a good American, thought, oh, hey, we're the heirs to a tomato paste fortune. This is fantastic, right? And then she looked up what contadina meant, because again, she doesn't speak any Italian. It means peasant, right? Which is to say, my ancestors were dirt farmers in central Italy, or at least some of them were. And they came here because that really wasn't a good deal for them. I have other ancestors who were peasants, Polish peasants in Russian Poland, right? Which was also not, right? These are not places that are known for their liberty and prosperity historically, right? So the concern is that people will come here, and on the one hand, they may retain their old habits, which is to say, everything about the place they came from taught them to be servile, to shut up, to keep their heads down, to do what they're told. They were not taught to know and value their rights and to be willing to defend them, right? The other problem that you might have, though, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just want to toss this over to Tova and everybody else, but I do want to ask this quick question and still give us kind of a lightning round answer. How did you immigrate back then? I mean, could you just come on in? It was before Ellis Island. Do you just docked your ship and walked off? And then how did you become a citizen when you did that? Just
Right.
briefly.
So as far as getting here, arriving in America, there really wasn't an organized immigration processing system for most of the first century. Individual states,
because they needed people here. They had country
well,
needed
they
to grow.
did, but also it was the case that especially in the first 40 or 50 years, the crossing was so difficult that the flow was not that heavy, and so those people were easily assimilated. There was, however, at the federal level from the very beginning, very clear and distinct naturalization policies, and they specified length of time that you had to be here. You had to demonstrate in open court with witnesses that you were a person of good character, and you also had to take an oath in which you specifically by name renounced the ruler of the country you came from. Right. So if you came from Prussia, for instance, you had to say that you specifically renounced whoever, Frederick William III. I don't know, I'm making that up. But you had to say that you rejected any loyalty or obedience to that person on the record. So they rejected the idea of say, dual citizenship.
Interesting. So you did have to take an oath to be naturalized to
Yes, you
certain
did.
things.
Yes, you did.
Yeah. Okay, so Tova, go ahead. Your turn.
Thank you. So what were the primary reasons for immigration in the early, in the period we're looking at? Why did most immigrants come over here?
Yeah, I think basic issues of trying to escape from the political and economic system that they inhabited. I mean, I think that's one of those things that's more or less universal, right, throughout American history, is that people are trying to escape from the situation that they were in, and using my own family as an example, although some of mine came rather later, right? The places that they were coming from, they weren't good places, and they came here, looking for liberty, looking for a better life, looking to escape from things like unending war. Right. So, not long after the Constitution is ratified, you have the outbreak of the French Revolution. And that kicks off more or less 25 years of constant warfare. Now, that on the one hand, that kind of restricted immigration because the British and French were fighting for control of the Atlantic and so on. But once that ended, there are a lot of people who are saying, okay, we need to get out of here. And also trying to get away from lords and kings who are going to take your property and conscript your sons into the army and all of those things, but simply trying to get away from the difficulties of the places that they had been born into.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And then did early immigrants have a lot of success assimilating into American culture, or was there resistance to assimilation or difficulties? And was there xenophobia in American society to a great extent back then?
Right. So it's kind of interesting because when we look at what was going on in sort of late 18th and early 19th century America, we see a lot of the same issues. So George Washington, for instance, says something that's a real problem, something that we want to avoid, is the idea of having immigrants from the same place all settle together in a little cluster in the same place. Right? Now, that's a warning that we haven't heeded particularly well. And he says the reason for that is that if they do that, then it's going to be harder for them to assimilate. And this is very natural because they're going to recreate the place that they came from, right? And that can have its goods and its bads, right? So on the one hand, growing up, I grew up in a neighborhood with lots of Italian immigrants and the food was amazing. So that's great. On the other hand, right, we know, and sort of Italians are kind of an example of an issue here. It took a couple of generations to sort of integrate my ancestors and their cohorts in, because they wanted to recreate the almost tribal way of life that had existed and that is fictionalized in various movies, Godfather and things like that. But sort of getting over that, getting them to accept our way of life. And Washington says that would have been a lot easier if we spread them out. If we said, look, go settle in different places, but that's hard to do, right? It's hard to compel people and tell people once they're here where precisely they have to live. So that's a hard thing to reconcile. There were concerns. Benjamin Franklin in the 1750s says, look, if we keep letting in all these Germans, it's kind of funny to think about. If we keep letting in all these Germans, we're all going to be speaking German in 40 or 50 years, because the Pennsylvania, the interior of Pennsylvania had become flooded with Germans. Now, what ended up happening was, with the coming of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the supply of new immigrants from Germany was cut off. And so the Germans that were here lost contact with the old world. And when they lost contact with the old world, they began to assimilate. They started speaking English, they intermarried, they moved around, right? They became part of the community. But that required, on the one hand, that loss of contact, and on the other hand, a larger body of native-born Americans who understood our way of life and could effectively assimilate them, right?
And then I guess you kind of answered this, but you can just try to answer it again, or maybe go a little more into detail.
Sure.
But, a lot of people call America, the nation of immigrants, or, the great melting pot. And
Right.
Virtually, I guess everyone in America is either descended from an immigrant, or is, descended from slaves or Native Americans, but most are descended from immigrants. And did the founding fathers conceive of this reality? Do you think they imagined that it would be like that, or did they encourage that if there was assimilation, or what did they view that vision as?
Okay, so I'm gonna try and answer this question. I don't want to be too long-winded, but a little bit of a story. So my advisor in college, mentor, guider, whatever you want to call him, he was a Hungarian refugee. He and his family escaped from Hungary in 1956. His father had been jailed by the communists and stood up against a wall by the Nazis in the early 40s, and had escaped. And when they escaped in 56, they went to a refugee camp in Austria. And while they were there, a West German diplomatic official showed up and was going through the camps and offered them West German citizenship on the spot, because even though they were Hungarian, they had a German last name. Okay. And so in other words, they had that last name indicated that they somewhere in their past were ethnically German. Okay. And so that meant that in the West German mind, you people are Germans by blood, you're part of us. And they turned it down. And as my advisor recounted later on, he wrote about this. He asked his father why they did this, and he said, we were born Americans, just in the wrong place. Right. And that's a fairly uniquely American concept. And probably the person who best expressed it was Abraham Lincoln. In a speech of his in 1858, during his famous contest with Stephen Douglas, he said that what makes us a people is not blood or ethnicity or soil or any of those things. It's an idea. Right? And the idea, he says, is the idea that's expressed in the Declaration of Independence. And anyone who believes in that idea, regardless of other considerations, anyone who's willing to live that idea and internalize it, can in principle become an American. And just say that doesn't give them the automatic right to be an American. There's other issues involved there. But in principle, anyone can become an American. Now, that's not true for most countries, right? You can look at what happened in Europe in the 20th century. Germany, for instance, at the beginning of the 20th century, had done as good a job of assimilating their Jewish population as any country in Europe. Right? But then suddenly, when it became an issue, it became apparent that you're not really part of us, and we're going to turn on you, right? And you know, a lot of Europeans were kind of that way, right? Because even though they might have adopted German customs and German culture and or any other country, France, fill in the blank, they were also still different, right? But because we're not based on that ethnic grouping, right, or even necessarily a shared religion, a shared confessional doctrine, we can, as long as we all believe that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. As long as we can share that, that's what will give us that commonality. Lincoln called it the electric cord that linked us all together.
Great. And then you were just my last question.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about assimilation and how, the founding fathers, at least most of them, wanted, immigrants to assimilate, or just how that was one thing you were talking about.
Mhm.
What do you define assimilation as? Or what did the founding fathers define assimilation as? What were their goals for that?
Yeah, so their goals were, I mean, maybe I kind of sort of answered this in the previous question, but just to kind of tease it out a little bit, their goals were people who shared the same basic political values, people who shared the same understanding of what liberty is, what justice is, those same basic ideas, people who were people who shared basic moral virtues, right? Now, that again, that doesn't necessarily mean sharing a particular religious teaching or confession, right? But people who were willing to respect the rights of others while also respecting their own rights. People who were willing to work to provide for themselves without, unnecessarily going to the public to provide for them. And they did, it's a different story, but the founders made provision for kind of welfare systems, but that was to be used sparingly. And so to create a kind of common or composite culture based on the same basic political values, that's what they meant. And I think part of that was adopting the language and recognizing, right? My ancestors, my great grandmother, who did come from the old country, came from Italy. She made all of her kids learn English. That was supposed to be their first language, and there was a recognition on the part of people who came here in those days that the place I came from was awful, and I don't want that here, right? I want something different, even if I don't know exactly how to get it, right? There had to be a sense that I'm trying to get away from something. The place I'm going to is supposed to be better than what I left, right? And so the people who came here had to kind of have that outlook if they were going to assimilate. Thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Tova. Thank you, Tova. Okay, Julian Jordan.
Thank you for everything you do at Hillsdale. We've definitely, experienced a lot of what Hillsdale puts out, and it's all really incredible.
Thank you.
For a
Appreciate
long,
that.
long time. Yeah, so this discussion's been pretty cool because I never heard of certain ones of these ideas. I understood principles of immigration, of course, from the founder's point of view. In my Constituting America speech, actually, I talked about how it's incredible that you can become an American, but you can't really be Chinese by moving to China or
Correct.
some other country. And then it's something else I heard. I think Dinesh D'Souza then said it about his own immigration story coming from India. And I've heard it other places as well. And it was something important to me that I realized when I written that speech, but I didn't understand the competing idea because I've never heard of the feudalistic idea. And I was actually realized this foundational philosophical difference, then this break from the founders, from this world before them. But because I never heard the feudalistic idea, it is an interesting idea, and it does make sense, and it can't be just brushed aside. And I wonder, because the founders really never brushed anything aside, they really took everything head on. I mean, even the right to revolt, they didn't just assume a right to revolt. They really put it through a torturous examination of saying why they have a right to revolt.
Yes, they did.
So in this idea of having the right to emigrate, do they deny any responsibility to the homeland, or do they say you have a greater good, that it's a greater good to have the right to immigrate or pursue virtue for yourself?
Yeah, look, so citizenship both involved, like anything else, like any law, it both conferred rights, but it also imposed responsibilities. And so one of the things that I, in my introduction, I couldn't get into it, but touched upon in passing, was that one had a right to emigrate, but only under certain conditions, right? So that you have a right to emigrate if you're starving in the country you're in, right? In other words, you're not obligated to stay behind when you can't provide for yourself, because at that point, the kind of the contract has, as it were, broken down. You can leave if the government is trying to do things that you never consented to allow it to do. So if the government begins to take on powers that were not granted to it, because then the government has sort of broken the contract. You can leave if the government is trying to do things that no government may rightfully do. So if it's trying to enslave its citizens or something like that in some concrete way, then you can leave. On the other hand, right, broadly speaking, you can't just up and go because the government is doing things that you disagree with, right? If they're not, so there has to be a kind of assessment, right? Or if you've enjoyed the benefits of that society, and now the time has come for you to share in its responsibilities. So for instance, you couldn't flee to avoid military service, right? You have enjoyed the protection that government has provided. So when the larger society calls upon you to bear some of the responsibilities of protecting that society, then you're obligated to fulfill those responsibilities. So it's a two-way street. I mean, you have rights, but you also have duties or responsibilities, just as, something like the law of nature says, yes, you have a right to liberty, but you also have to respect the liberty of others. There's a duty that corresponds to the right.
I find that just the way of talking about it like this is so much more true and important when you're speaking of that. So you're not saying, so they weren't saying just denying that truth at all. They were incorporating it really into a bigger truth or bigger reality. We lose the ability to have a discussion like this at all currently. I mean, I had no idea that this was really at the bedrock of the immigration argument. And I'm kind of surprised just because it's come up so much in my life. And I know that we rarely do discuss the superordinate principles that guide any policy. And that's really where you have to go when you're looking at the founders. And what I'm seeing more and more now is that the entire philosophy of natural law and policy and civil law to them was woven together. So it wasn't like there was going to be one nail sticking out that didn't make sense. The immigration had to make sense with the other principles as well.
Right. I think that's right. I mean, that this was the system they created was exactly that. It was an integrated system where they tried to think through all the various aspects of policy. And look, right, there's always the fact, and you can never sort of escape from this, and it would be a disservice to deny it, that they're human beings, right? And sometimes they fail to fully live up to their principles, and we know that. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about the ways in which that was the case, and that can be helpful because it can help us to think more fully about them and to try and do a better job of putting them into practice to actually secure justice is by seeing, the successes and the failures and the achievements and the shortcomings. But no, this was part of an integrated system. They had presumed from the very beginning that people were going to come to this country and want to join it. And so they had to think through, because that's what they themselves had done, or their ancestors. And so they had to think through what that was going to look like. And the specifics have sort of evolved and adapted over time. But what we've kind of lost is, as you point out, is we've lost the ability to think about this issue as part of a larger system and not simply have a kind of gut emotional reaction to something we're seeing.
I think Jordan's got.
You ready?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, great.
So through our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about birthright citizenship.
Yes.
And it seems that would violate the ideals of the founders.
Mm-hmm.
So what would their view or practical application be to the ideal?
Okay, so in other words, kind of how would this work in practice, right? How did their system work? Well, when the society first formed, when you first constitute the country, then the idea is that the people who are going to be part of that should all agree, right? And the way that we do that, of course, the way that we did that with the Constitution is through the ratification process with conventions, where the various states as kind of constituent parts of the society agreed to that, and the people of those states elected delegates to ratifying conventions to go through that process. And so the constitutional system, the Constitution has legitimacy derived from that popular approval, from that ratification. But then when new people want to come in, right, you essentially have a kind of contract between two parties. The first party is the person who wants in, right? And the second party is the rest of us who are already here. And the rest of us who are already here would speak through the laws that we made. So the Constitution gives us a right, gives the federal government the power to make immigration and naturalization laws. And so we make those laws and say, okay, here are the rules under which we will let people in. And then here are a set of rules under which we will admit people to citizenship. If you, the would-be new resident or would-be new citizen, agree to those terms, then we have a mutual agreement like any other contract. Like my bank offers me terms on a mortgage, I can accept them or not accept them. And if I choose not to accept them, the bank and I go our separate ways. And if the would-be immigrant / citizen accepts them, then he's welcome. And if not, then we part ways. There's no inalienable natural right to be in the United States. And there's no inalienable natural right to be a citizen. That's an agreement.
So is it necessary then to see that idea of nations as sovereign, as individual sovereign things? Because that was an interesting thing you said, that they see them almost as individuals with sovereign rights.
Yeah. So this is nations, kind of act towards each other, relate towards each other, separate nations, the way individuals do in a situation where there's no common government, right? And the UN doesn't really constitute a government. It doesn't have an enforcement power. It can't make binding rules in the way that the US government or the government of my state can make those rules. And so kind of think about life on the playground when you were in elementary school, right? That is to say that, yeah, the teachers are there, but the reality is that the kids are kind of on their own, right? And so now that there are rules, there's the laws of nature and so on, but there's no official contracted agreement between them. It's just kind of everybody's there. And nations are the same way. There's no formal government over top of them. A foreign citizen and the people of the United States kind of have that relationship to one another. There's no common government over them, right? So what the new migrant is trying to do is to become somehow part of that whole. He's asking to be integrated in, and it has to be something, if you're going to say that all men are created equal, the way the Declaration does, then it has to be an agreement that is mutual and reciprocal, right? There was a time in American history where we tried grabbing people, forcibly bringing them here and making them be a part of our society. That was really bad, right? We don't want that. There's a word for that. It was slavery, right? That we rejected that. We rightly rejected that. It's an abomination. Well, the reverse of that would be for someone to just walk in the front door and say, you know what, I'm going to impose an agreement on you and you're stuck with it, right? You don't have any say in it. And that, in a way, that's what the illegal immigrant does, right? It's a kind of tyranny where we don't think of it that way because the United States is big and powerful and the migrant is poor and dejected and all of these things in many cases. So we don't think of it that way, but that's what it is, because the person who's doing that is saying, I have a right to impose things on you without your consent. Right. And that's a real problem from the perspective of the idea that all men are created equal.
Thank you. I think it's time to go over to Kathy, correct?
Yeah, Kathy, go ahead. But we may
Thank
come
you,
back
both
to you,
of you.
Jill and Jordan.
Appreciate it very
All right.
much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Porteus. We have a listener that had emailed in a question, Mary T, who had wondered, was there a debate in the Constitutional Convention about immigration, or what was the nature of the debate? Was there more or less uniform agreement, or did the founders really disagree? And also, could you talk a little bit about how the immigration changed from the Articles of Incorporation to the Constitution itself?
Mhm. So maybe I can take those backwards, if that's okay. The Articles of Confederation, and actually the problems they encountered with naturalization policy under the Articles of Confederation led to the naturalization clause in the Constitution. Because what happened was, under the Articles of Confederation, with its emphasis on unrestricted state sovereignty, the individual states made the decision about whether or not to naturalize an immigrant. And if just because you were a citizen of one state did not mean you were a citizen of another. Okay, although, right, the Articles of Confederation then went on to say that citizens of one state are entitled to privileges and immunities of citizenship in the other states. Okay, so here's what would happen. Different states would have different naturalization laws, some strict, some more relaxed. And migrants began to figure this out. And so what they would do is they would go to the states with lax immigration policies, lax naturalization policies, and go there and become citizens, and then go to the place that they wanted to go, even if they would not have qualified for citizenship at that point in that state, right? So in other words, immigrants were using that diversity of naturalization laws to get around the laws of some states. And so they figured the best way to solve this problem was to put into Congress's hands a power to make a uniform rule of naturalization. That is, say, same across the board for everybody, regardless of where you're coming from or where you're going to. Right? Everybody has the same standards. And so that led to a bunch of naturalization laws as they kind of worked out the policy over the first 10 or 15 years under the Constitution. So when they got to the Constitutional Convention, this was kind of recognized to the point where it wasn't a huge debate in the way that, the Connecticut Compromise was a huge debate, or the small states versus large states plans was a debate, or executive power was a debate. And they kind of recognized that we have this problem and here's a practical solution.
Great.
Quick question on that. Hang on, Kathy, I just want to add a little, as you're talking about people coming in and going to certain states and with lax immigration and then infiltrating to another one, how do they even keep track? I mean, people,
Sure.
They could just, how did you know who was here? I mean, they could just dock their ship in some dark little corner and,
Absolutely.
How did they track?
Right. No, that was difficult. And so as a matter of immigration, especially in those early days when immigration wasn't very heavy, it wasn't very heavily policed, right? But naturalization was much more heavily policed. So you had to be able to prove that you had been a resident for a certain period of time. And that meant producing witnesses. That meant producing, hey, here was my employer. Here was this person who helped me with this or that can prove that I've been here for a certain amount of time. And that time actually varied. The length seesawed between 2 and 12 years until it finally settled on 5 years in the Naturalization Act of 1802, which kind of became the standard. But no, in those days when immigration was when immigration was very light, they didn't really police ingress that much. They didn't have to.
Right. So I'm going to go back to Kathy, but I guess what you're saying is you could come in this country and maybe not be discovered, but if you wanted to have land or homestead or really, integrate into the country, at some point you were going to have to become naturalized in order to get those grants. And if to do that, you'd have to answer those questions. Okay, that's cool. Kathy, go ahead. Go ahead, Kathy.
Well, next week, we're going to be talking about Ellis Island. And Dr. Porteus, you had mentioned that there was a really important court case leading up to Ellis Island in 1898.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that and tee us up for our next episode on Tuesday, the 27th?
Sure. So everything that we've discussed here about the consent principle and the rejection of birthright citizenship and the idea of government based on a compact or a contract between the various citizens, all of that prevailed as the standard in American law until 1898. And in 1898, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called United States v. Wong Kim Ark. And Wong Kim Ark was a person born in the United States to Chinese parents, right? And under a treaty we had with the Chinese imperial government, right? All of those migrants and their descendants were subjects of the Chinese empire, right? They were not American citizens. So Wong Kim Ark left the country, right? And then left the United States, went to China, and then when he came back, was denied entry on the grounds that he was not a citizen. And we had subsequently passed a bill, and this is, I'm just mentioning it. It's not necessarily something that the founders would agree with or I agree with, but Congress had passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, saying that we weren't going to let more persons in from the Chinese empire. And so that worked its way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in that case, and the judge who wrote the opinion, the justice, his name was Horace Gray, he simply said, oh yeah, the founders obviously meant birthright citizenship. And he really doesn't produce any evidence. And in fact, he directly contradicts his own ruling from a case 15 years earlier involving a Native American called Elk v. Wilkins, where he made a ruling that was very much in line with how the founders viewed the citizenship issue. In 1898, for reasons that I've never fully understood, he just turns that around. He just ignores 100+ years of American history and American law and just rewrites the whole thing. And so what that means is that from then on out, we increasingly grow to accept the idea that simply being born in the United States is sufficient for full citizenship.
Great, thank you.
You mean as opposed to consenting
Yes.
and all
Yeah.
of those things
That's correct.
that we talked about. And so that Supreme Court judge just negated naturalization.
Yeah, so there was still naturalization for people who came here from other places, right? But it meant that that you could have things like birth tourism, right, where people come from other countries specifically to have a baby on American soil, so that child becomes an American citizen. Prior to 1898, there's no such thing as birth tourism. There's no such thing as anchor babies, right? Those things don't exist because those children are under their parents, and their parents are the subjects of some other government, right? Mm-hmm. Because citizenship rested on consent, that meant that children weren't really part of that, because only rational creatures can give consent, and children aren't rational. So if you look at the early American naturalization laws, for instance, what they said was that the status of the children followed the father, right? So if the father becomes an American citizen, his children can follow along with him, and we choose to offer them citizenship when they become adults, right? But they're not, simply being born here did not automatically make you a citizen, right? So we didn't have any of those problems, the legal problems that we have today with things like anchor babies.
That's really interesting. That's worth, Kathy, I know you have to go, don't you, Kathy? You have to go?
Yeah, I do. But thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And we're going to wrap up here. I find that to be really, really interesting. And I was going to, the naturalization aspect of the man from China, though, I just want to clarify that before we close. He was here, and then he went away, and he came back, and they wouldn't let him in under a naturalization process.
Well, what happened was he had not been naturalized, and we had signed a treaty with the Chinese government saying that we would not naturalize these people, that they would retain their Chinese citizenship, even though they were in the United States. And look, I mean, the Chinese Exclusion Act, there's a lot of prejudice going on there, whatever, fine. Okay, so but that was the agreement that we had made. And so he left, And the Chinese government's claim, which we accepted, was that he was a Chinese citizen. Right. And we had also enacted a law saying that we would not be admitting more Chinese citizens in the United States. And so the citizenship question is vital. If he is a Chinese citizen, then he can't come back in. But if being born here made him an American citizen, and he was born on United States territory, he was born in California, I think. If that made him a citizen, then we have to let him back in. Right? He's not covered under those treaties or laws. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so in trying to resolve the question of whether or not Wong Kim Ark can enter the United States, the court has to resolve the citizenship question. And in order to decide that he's a citizen, they have to junk 120 plus years of American sort of legal tradition.
Okay, so I understand now. So in other words, they let him in based on the fact he'd been born here.
Yeah.
That's what they did.
Yep.
Okay. Jill and Jordan, I don't know if you caught that the first time, Aubrey, but I didn't quite catch it the first time. So that they did it so that to let him back in because he had been born here. But when they did that, they negated 100 some odd years of consent. And at that time, you had to kind of, I guess, be old enough to consent.
Yes. Yeah. Like I said,
so
only rational creatures could consent. Right.
So when would that happen? So if, sorry to interrupt, but if a child were born in the country, we have to wrap this up, but it's so fascinating. I know, just last question. If you were born in this country, you still weren't a citizen until you were, say, 18? And
yeah, until you reach the age. Yeah, until you reach the age you could give consent. The presumption was that you were under the authority of your parents. And so you were governed by U.S. law because you were on U.S. soil, U.S. territory, in the same way that a tourist who comes here has to obey the laws while they're here. But let's say if in my childhood, my parents were to leave and become citizens of fill in the blank country while I was still a minor, then the old understanding of American law presumed that I went with them. Right, as a minor child, and then whatever, if my parents went and became citizens of Russia, just as an example, I don't know why we would do that, but I would go with them, and then my status as a citizen of Russia, once my parents had obtained citizenship, would be subject to Russian law, right? But if the reverse happened, if when I was a child, my parents came here from someplace else, right, then my status would be governed. Once my parents became citizens, then my status would be governed by American law. And what American law did, even from the very beginning, was said with those people was, okay, you will become citizens upon adulthood, right? Which we defined to be at that time, they defined that to be 21 years of age.
Interesting. So there's a guarantee of it, though.
Yes, they did that, but there was no automatic right. It was something. It's something they talk about a lot. They did it as a prudential matter because it would be suicidal not to, as a country, not to provide a way to incorporate these new citizens. We've got these people here. They've lived here sometimes for extended periods of time. They don't necessarily know any other place is home. They're good. Right? We want those people. And so they the law made an automatic offer of citizenship to them when they became adults.
Okay. I'm sorry, I just have to ask one last question. If y'all need to go, you can go, but I just have to one last question. What's the difference then between being born here and being automatically a citizen and being automatically a citizen when you're 18, so to speak? Okay. If you give it to someone automatically when they're 18, what's the difference?
Right. So the child of the legal immigrant who comes here. So I'm the child of a legal immigrant, let's just say for the sake of example. Right, that's something that we have extended to persons who come here consistent with our laws. Right, but I wasn't born here. I came here as a young child, and I may have lived here from the time I was 5 years old, 8 years old, 10 years old, and the regime offers me the country offers me citizenship, which I can then accept or reject. But they've made a decision that I'm a person who, even though I was not born here, right, we want that person. Right? But with birthright citizenship, it's saying automatically, just because you happen to have been born on our soil, we automatically have this relationship, right? And the claim is that and so again, that's not. even if you came here not in accordance with the laws, right? Even if your parents came here under either illegally or under dubious circumstances, in the case of something like birth tourism, right? The old understanding was that if my parents were lawfully the subject of, just make it as real a circumstance as possible. If my parents are citizens of the Republic of Mexico, right? And if I follow my parents, right, as the founders thought that we did, then my status is that I am subject to the jurisdiction of the Republic of Mexico, following my parents. And so even though I was born here, right, I am not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in the sense of not being subject to the jurisdiction of any other country. And so that meant that my citizenship status and what would happen to me going forward was a question of Mexican law and not of American law, right? The presumption was that I'm under Mexican authority, right? Now, if subsequently my parents became American citizens, and the law said that the children of naturalized citizens could become citizens too, then that would be different. But that's not by virtue of where I was born. That's by virtue of an agreement that's been made among the people of the United States, the consent rather than soil.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Sorry, I kept you 8 minutes
No, that's
over
okay.
here. Sorry, everybody. It's very intriguing. I could talk to you forever. You have been fantastic.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so
Dr.
much. This has
Portteus.
been great.
Yeah. Right, Julian, Jordan, and Aubrey. Wasn't he wonderful?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for being part of it.
Yeah. So you really terrific. Great guest. Very, very knowledgeable. And Julian and Jordan always asking very heady questions.
Yes.
Always. Aren't they great? They always ask these questions. I have to listen to your questions as much as I have to listen. Because they're so intellectual. But anyway, thank you, Julian Jordan. Thank you, Dr. Portteus. Thank you, Aubrey. And thank you everyone joining us today. Sorry we kept you a little bit later. And next Tuesday, it's going to be immigration and Ellis Island and how things evolved and changed. So we hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll see you for book club Thursday night about Written on the Heart. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.